the format is going to be that they may have a short presentation each or talk about some things each, but the vast majority of the evening is going to come from question and answer. I'll be going around with a microphone and capturing your questions, so store them up and we're going to bombard these guys. So I think the easiest thing to do is for them to introduce themselves. They can pass the microphone down, and let's get to it.
Can you hear me without the microphone?
No.
We need it for the recording.
We need it for the recording anyway.
Okay, you can hear me better with the microphone?
Yes.
All right, sorry, I can't get away from it.
Alan, could you sit down because we're video recording?
Okay.
Just give they can see you. Everybody can see you.
My name is Alan Block. I'm not an engineer. I'm a general contractor. I've been a general contractor in Berkeley, in the Oakland, El Cerrito, Albany area for over 30 years, and I've done many retrofits. For most of my career as general contractor, I did home inspections. And some of you, that's how I got here, through previous clients. And over the years, I did about over 5,000 homes in Berkeley, Oakland, El Cerrito, Albany, this area. So I've seen many retrofits, and I've done many retrofits, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the history of retrofitting, sort of give you a little bit of background, and also about what can go wrong in a retrofit, okay, which happens quite frequently. There was a major quake in the San Fernando Valley in 1971, and the thing that distinguished this earthquake from earlier quakes is that several hospitals with patients in them were severely damaged. So all of a sudden there was, in 1971, it was a quake not that large, well, it was about a 7, which is of course large near the epicenter. And what happened as a result of that is people became very concerned about earthquakes and very concerned about earthquake bracing. So as a result of that earthquake, in 1972, two senators in California, Alquist and Criollo, proposed to the legislature that they begin to designate an area called the Special Study Zone. And the Special Study Zone, what they noticed was that where there was fault rupture, where the ground actually ruptured, that there was the damage was much more severe. No matter how much you can brace a building, if it's basically on a ruptured piece of ground, there's nothing that's going to save that building. And other people may disagree, but that's, I think, generally regarded as true. So the Alquist-Criollo measure, which was passed, gives about 1/8 of a mile each way from a known fault. And the provision is that buildings within 1/8 of a mile have to be stouter, have to have special considerations in the foundation. As far as I can see, it has not, for some reason, it's not been implemented, or was implemented and is not now implemented. Maybe these other gentlemen can talk about that, but as far as I can see, that at this present time, it's sort of very spotty in enforcement. But what happened, even more importantly for me, was that a man named Peter Yanev, who went from this area, went down to Los Angeles, went down to the San Fernando Valley, and he looked at buildings, and he came back and he proclaimed, and it was written in the Chronicle, $200 worth of plywood, we could have saved these houses. That's what he said. Just a little bit of bracing, because the weak point in most houses built before the 1950s, is the area between the mass of the house and the foundation. What carpenters, and I apologize for the word, but what carpenters typically call on the site the cripple wall, or we more officially call short stud wall, which is the area between essentially the first floor and the foundation. Now what happens is people think, well, the house shifts and that little wall, I'm going to have to put up with it for a minute, that little wall wants to go like this, or like that. And in fact, what's happening is the ground is shifting. The house is staying put, but the ground is shifting underneath it. For our purposes, it's the same thing, because that little wall wants to basically roll over, just like if it was a deck of cards that you set on its side and then it fell over, and just the way it falls over is what happens. The house typically, and the good news is that people in wood frame houses typically are not severely injured or not. If they're injured, it's from a chandelier or a bookcase. But what happens is that the house is then on the ground. That the little cripple wall between the house and the foundation has collapsed, and there's nothing to do. You can't get the house up again. So the houses end up generally having to be bulldozed. There's no way to save them. So what Peter Yanev said is $200 worth of earthquake bracing, and we could have saved all these houses that he saw were destroyed and had to be demolished. So that was the beginning of what is now, I think, a major industry, or a major residential industry in Northern California, is this business of earthquake bracing. But there's no question about the fact that the most dangerous buildings that you might be in at the time of an earthquake are not wood frame structures. Particularly, they're not wood frame single-story structures. The really dangerous buildings are the unreinforced masonry buildings, buildings with brick foundations, buildings with towering, slender chimneys that are unreinforced, buildings with brick facades. These are the buildings that are really going to cause, as occurred in Loma Prieta and Santa Cruz. If people are widespread, numbers of people are hurt, it's going to be because probably of unreinforced masonry or heavy objects over your head. There are three main points. I might say in my own work, I've seen coming as many bungled retrofits as I've seen successful retrofits. Okay? In other words, people, a contractor or a guy with a pickup truck and a ladder will go and look under a house, and you look at it and you say, well, you just put up the plywood here, and it'll be fine. And you can do something that'll look just like a correct retrofit, but in fact, it'll be completely wrong. So the most common error that I would see is that people would leave elements out. And that you would end up homeowners would end up spending all this money to reinforce their houses, to strengthen their houses, for the safety of their families. And in the end, what would happen is their house would be essentially as vulnerable as it was to begin with. So the three things that we try to accomplish in a typical house, okay, and houses vary. So I'm going to give you sort of your what we try to do in a typical bungalow, okay? A single-story bungalow in Berkeley on a particularly flat lot. Is the first thing we do is we want to secure the house to the foundation. And that, you all know, is done with bolts. Bolts, masonry bolts that are accepted into masonry that are put through the mud sills. Mud sill is a piece of wood that sits on the foundation, and we want to secure that down. Typically in houses that were built before roughly the Second World War were unbolted. So that was an innovation that really came with the kind of use of steel in the Second World War. I might say that also typically foundations before the 40s were generally not reinforced. Before the late 30s were not reinforced. So what that means is not reinforced is they didn't have steel in them. Concrete is very strong. Concrete is very strong in compression. If you take a piece of concrete and you put an enormous amount of weight on it, there's nothing you can do that you're not going to squash it. You're not going to squash it, okay? Concrete's very, very strong in compression. But concrete is not strong in tension. You can't make a pencil of concrete and have it be as strong as a pencil of steel, or even a pencil of wood. It'll snap and it's brittle. So with the introduction of steel into concrete, approximately at the time of the Second World War, I would say that was the biggest single innovation in construction in the world in the 20th century, is the introduction of steel into concrete. And if you have a house that was built from the late 30s onward, it probably has steel because steel was required, I don't know, in the code from that point on. So the first thing you want to do is secure the house to the foundation with bolts. The second thing that we want to do is we want to take that area, that little short stud wall or cripple wall between the foundation and the first floor or the main floor, and we want to stiffen it. And plywood is the best possible material to do that, because plywood, no matter how much pressure you put on it, if you put a piece of plywood on its side and you try to, again, turn it into a parallelogram, you with me visually? say if this were a piece of plywood and we tried to put pressure on the top, turn it into a parallelogram, you couldn't do it. The plywood would typically shatter before it turns into a parallelogram. So plywood is a particularly good material to use to stiffen that area between the foundation and the floor frame. You with me? Okay, and actually I brought on the piano here, I didn't realize how many people would be here, but I brought about 40 copies of a book that explains this from the Simpson Company, and you're welcome to take those. And then the third thing, we've prevented the house from sliding off the foundation with bolts. We put in plywood, which has got to be correctly nailed and correctly connected, attached to the foundation. That's the usual, that is, I would say, the most common error that homeowners and inexperienced people make in retrofitting houses, is that they don't understand that it's not just enough to nail the plywood to the studs, but the plywood actually has to be attached, structurally attached to the foundation. And we actually have an expert in this here tonight, Thor Madison, who's back in the corner. He's even got a new book out on the subject.
There's actually a copy of the book in the back for you to take a look at with how to purchase on the front page.
Right. And anyway, technical questions, Thor is your guy. Anyway, and then the third part of this, and I'm talking again about just a bungalow, is to attach then, get this plywood that we've put in between the foundation and the first floor framing, and we want to get the plywood secured to the floor diaphragm, to the floor joist. So those are the three steps. And I would say that many of the jobs done by, this is not highly technical work, but it's work that you really have to do right. Because if you do it wrong, it's going to be completely ineffective. And we've all seen, anyone in the field who's crawled under houses has seen many done wrong. And it's always a shock to people who've spent thousands of dollars and it's been done wrong. So, let's see. The grade of plywood is important. That's a technical point which hopefully you as a homeowner will not have to deal with it. You want to use a structural grade, not just a sheathing grade. The thickness of the plywood is important in terms of the strength. And then, let's see what else do I have in my notes. And so, Berkeley, because there were so many cases of improper and wrong earthquake bracing, where people just basically threw their money away on some guy who said, oh, I know how to do this. So Berkeley came up with, I think, was it San Leandro first, or was it Berkeley? San Leandro, okay. Anyway, Berkeley came up with something called Plan Set A, which was mentioned before. What Plan Set A, what they said in Berkeley was, also, Berkeley has this provision in the code, or in the city rules, that if you buy a house, you get charged 1.5% transfer tax. You're probably all familiar with this, especially if you've had to pay it. It's an outrageous amount. But anyway, you get back 1/3 of that if you apply it toward earthquake bracing with a separate permit. Okay, what I've noticed recently is the city seems to be very disagreeable about giving you your money back. They seem to want to throw everything in the way not to give you your money back. But if you do it according to the rules, and you bought a house recently, and a buyer can take this, or a seller can take this. Anyway, the city of Berkeley took some steps, much to its credit, to try to assure that homeowners would get a fair shake on money spent on earthquake bracing. Okay? So what they did is they published this thing called Plan Set A, which I have a copy of here, and anyone can see it. Okay, I'm not going to open it. No, I'm not going to open it. I'm just going to wave it here. I'm going to wave these blank papers. Anyway, this is Plan Set A. And what Plan Set A does is it says any house with a cripple wall, short stud wall, the distance between the foundation and the first floor, that's 4 feet or less. 4 feet or less, and the house is generally uniform in shape. Doesn't have a lot of ins and outs and a lot of, bends or foundation that goes down a hill. That really standard. They said, here's the plan right here. We're going to give it to you. They're going to give this to the contractor, and so that the contractor cannot get it wrong. I mean, it's sort of like baby feeding a little bit here, but that's what they did. And I think much to their credit, it was a great idea. So Plan Set A is available, and you're welcome to see it. The problem with Plan Set A is that Plan Set A only applies to a house with a short stud wall that's less than 4 feet. Okay, so if you get a house on a hill, or you get a house, with an odd shape to it, then you really do need an engineer. And a couple more just little points. I would say to you, people say, well, do I really need to spend the money on an engineer? That's sort of like, I've got to get the work done. Why don't, this is pretty standard stuff. What I would say to you is if your house is not completely cookie cutter, you need an engineer. And you need an engineer to look it over, especially if it's a 60s house with vaulted ceilings, no attic, or with a clear story that goes up. You really do need an engineer, and it's a very foolish thing to avoid that. Let's see, with that said, the houses that are particularly difficult, I would just call your attention. I think everyone here at this point probably knows what a soft story is. So a soft story is a house, is a building with a big void in the lower level. So, for example, those buildings that you saw in the pictures in Loma Prieta that just, again, rolled over like a deck of cards. Apartment buildings in San Francisco, you remember in the marina? Well, the lower level of the buildings just basically sat on vertical toothpicks, or vertical posts, vertical walls. And so there was nothing, the technical term is shear, which means a capacity to resist lateral load. And there was nothing in those buildings to resist lateral load. As long as it was only gravity that they were trying to hold up, they worked fine. As soon as there was another force, a sideways force from an earthquake, they collapsed. So there are many houses, if you drive around, I'm sure every one of you will see at least one house on your block that is a soft story. And the way you can recognize a soft story is it's a garage door opening. It could even be a big picture window, which occupies a significant part of the wall, and then another story on top of it. So the lower level is considered soft in the sense that it will collapse or can collapse if it gets the right kind of push to the side. And it's very important, and there have been a lot of techniques invented in the last 20 years to compensate for soft stories, to make them stronger. But all of them seem to involve some amount of taking apart, disassembling, and putting back together. The other buildings that are particularly that and I've looked at in the years, people would call me out, and occasionally I'd get somebody would show me a building that was all terracotta tile. You know what that means? I mean, this is a building that's destined to fail in an earthquake, even a moderate quake. Basically, it's a building from the 20s. People built them in this area because of response to the 1923 fire, because they thought they were fire safe. So you have a building built basically out of orange clay tile without concrete, without reinforcing, and those are buildings that I personally would not let anyone that I care about stay in, because these are buildings that are going to hurt people. The other buildings that are particularly problematic are buildings that are sitting on stilts or buildings built on hillsides that you really have to take special care to reinforce. And then finally, I just mentioned split-level houses. Split-level houses need special attention because you have to take the two parts of the split level and sort of treat them somewhat separately in embracing them. They don't, whereas a normal house on one level, you can brace some of it and that bracing will carry over to the rest of the house very effectively. A split level is more difficult, just more complicated. So I think the thought that I'd like to leave you with is if you're going to spend money on earthquake bracing, which I think is money well spent, peace of mind, resale, however else you want to look at it, what I would say to you is spend your money wisely. If you've been in your house for a while and you have a lot of equity, it really, I think what Peter Yanov said, $200 worth of plywood, we could have saved these houses, is not really true, but the idea is true. That for a few $1,000s, usually for under $10,000, you can make a house pretty earthquake prepared. Last thought, which is, people talk about, I've heard the term earthquake-proofing a house. There is no such thing. If you're going to get fault rupture, there is no way to earthquake-proof a house. Okay, and there's no way to take a house built before the last few years and bring it up to current standards. It's just, it's not possible, but you can make them much, much safer than they are now, and you can probably save lives in the process. Thank you.